To the cloud. All right. Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, October 30th, and welcome to the SIG testing meeting. I am your host, Aaron of SIG Beard. Since this meeting is being publicly recorded and will be posted to YouTube later, please keep in mind that we have a code of conduct, which basically boils down to don't be a jerk. Today, we're going to have a discussion from Avi Condretti. I should have asked you how to pronounce your last name before I started this on a proposal for K-unit presubmits with Prow, and then we're going to have a bunch of questions, conversations kicked off by Patrick Lang around unit testing, end-to-end testing, and Windows. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sen and Avi.
Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. So I work on a project called K-Unit, which is trying to introduce unit testing into the Linux kernel. Part of our effort is to also drive pre-submit. And since the Linux kernel does a lot of their work on mailing lists, we were thinking of having a pre-submit service that would receive patches from mailing lists, apply those patches onto the kernel, run tests, and email back to these mailing lists. I think I shared a design doc on the, yeah.
I'm not sure you shared it with the mailing list because I don't have access to it.
Oh.
Yeah, give me a sec. I'll take care of that real quick.
Okay.
No worries. Yeah, I'm gonna do that. Try now. I should have shared it with Kubernetes dev. So if you're if you're signed in as if you are a Kubernetes dev member, that should work. Anybody want to confirm that? Oh, it says I must be the owner.
Dang, okay, here. Sorry about that.
The mailing list is Kubernetes SIG Testing, like Google Groups.
Yeah, I tend to.
KDev is also good.
Yeah, I share with KDev for read and SIG Testing for comment usually, but whatever works for you. Welcome to the fun of drafting Google Docs with your google.com email address instead of your Gmail address.
Is this like googlegroup.com?
Yes, googlegroups.com.
So who gates the design doc? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
There's no formal way of doing this. I just generally, whenever I'm doing a Google Doc, I like to make it readable by anybody who's a member of Kubernetes dev and make it writable or commentable by anybody in SIG testing if it's a SIG testing thing.
I'm sorry, never mind. I was asking which group you had to be a member of to access it, but I saw it via the email that just went out. It's Kubernetes SIG Testing.
Oh, okay, so you got it, okay.
Yeah, we got it. It's working.
Okay. So I've been talking with with Sen, and we were considering two different possibilities. So if you go down to the design ideas, so one possibility is to have a Git server that would receive these patches, apply them to the kernel in a new branch, pass that branch over to a prod job, and then that'd be fairly simple because you would do everything before you wouldn't have to alter anything about how prod jobs or the init containers work. But this might have a lot of overhead, partially because we'd have to have another Git server on top of the ones that the maintainers already have. And
I'm sorry, Avi, because I'm taking notes here. Maybe you said this and I missed it, but what was the value prop of this? What problem is it solving? So I can add that at the top.
Yeah, so we're trying to introduce unit testing into the Linux kernel, and for our thinking is that for unit testing to sort of become something that everyone decides to do when developing for the kernel, it would have to be an integral part of their development process. Sort of, if you have pre-submit tests that run your unit tests, you'll be more likely to, maintain your unit tests and make sure that they pass everything. So, and since the kernel primarily does their development on the mailing list, and they consider patches on the mailing list, and usually maintainers will manually pull these patches, apply it to their fork of the kernel, and then test manually. It would be useful if they could, if we could have a service that would run these tests for them and email the mailing list.
Gotcha. There was a conversation going on the chat what this had to do with Kubernetes, but I think somebody answered it. This is to extend Prow to support ingesting patches via a mailing list. Linux kernel mailing list being one of those, right? As a possibility.
Yeah.
I was trying to genericize it so I know how to write it. Thank you.
And the other possible solution we were thinking of, since there was some discussion about having a mail server in Prow, we could find a way to have that mail server receive these patches and then have them accessible somehow for the clone-refs container to possibly apply these patches after cloning the kernel. And that has more implications because we would have to have CRDs for these patches, and that might get out of hand, and we'd have to change some of the logic for clone-refs. So I'm not too comfortable with this. So
real quickly, so what are the major pieces of the Prow infrastructure that you're trying to make use of here? Like a lot of these proposals, whether you're setting up the Git server as a standalone thing, whether you're changing clone refs, like they seem like fairly large changes to the way that the large infrastructure works right now. So what are you trying to reuse? What are the things about Prow that are interesting to you?
So it's just a different way of trigger a job.
Well, it's a different way of triggering a job. It's a different way of cloning the refs. It's a different way of reporting the status. It seems like,
if you look at the proposal, the actual design that's out doesn't involve things like changing clone refs. The stuff that maintains Git will live outside of Prow. It will just do it in a way that's suitable to Prow, and I think that's actually the gist of it. Is like they won't need to change that by adapting to it. They'll probably just need good enough support for sending triggers to Prow.
I was going to say, isn't the only real question here the signal that would be mailing list based, and then beyond that, like somebody could create a container that does whatever needs to happen once the signal's there, right?
Right.
Prowl's just not designed to, unless there's a repo that it can monitor, right?
Well, so that's one of the
that's
proposals.
what this proposes.
That's one of the proposals, right? It seems like there are two alternatives being suggested here, and one is have a repo that Prow could monitor. The other would be, what if instead we had Prow actually be capable of receiving and sending emails? I think either way, a lot of different facets of this line up nicely with our intent to abstract away the reporting for Prow, because we definitely want to be able to report job results, job statuses in different places and ways. And we also want Prow to be triggered by different things. Like GitHub is not the only change management system out there. So I think this is really great and encourages us to think along a different dimension where, like, what if not everything was a web service, but there was also mail involved here? And I think I like the first approach in that context a lot better, where we talk about just maintaining another Git server. I know in the cons it's called out as like, well, now we have to maintain another piece of infrastructure. But I think in the interest of keeping Prow well scoped, we kind of don't want Prow to become its own change control system. It seems like having that very distinct or abstract, like receive things, do things based on them, and then report back out makes it a lot more reusable. So I was curious maybe how strongly you feel the con of maintaining additional external infrastructure. Maybe to go back to your original scope, when you're talking about unit testing for the kernel, is this for a specific small audience, or is the intent to grow this to the entire Linux kernel mailing list?
The intent is eventually to grow this to the entire kernel community.
Okay.
So at first, we're planning to use it internally in our team. So we have a mailing list for KUnit, and once KUnit gets mainstreamed into the upstreamed into the kernel, we were thinking that at that point, if it's accepted into the kernel, there would need to be support for it in general for the Linux community, and maintainers would probably be encouraged to use the service too. And so, I just want to clarify earlier. So we really do want reporting back to the mailing list in either case, partially because not having it report back to the mailing list would be like a departure from how development's done for the kernel. So if
So I think if we do, like when we do take the current GitHub reporting logic out of Plank, having a deployment of a service analogous to Trigger that creates the project CODs from mailing lists, and a deployment of a controller that reports back would be two standalone ways for you to make use of the Plank controller and actually run your jobs. Could you talk about, like you said that some patches depend on other patches and stuff, and so like if you were to host an intermediate Git server with pullable refs for all the things that you wanted to actually test, how much processing are you doing to generate those refs? Because it almost, like right now, the way the clone refs is working is assuming a lot about GitHub, and so I wonder if it makes sense for clone refs to operate separately, or for you to have a compatibility layer that takes the kernel patches, makes something that looks like a bunch of GitHub refs, so that clone refs can still work the way it does today.
Yeah, I think the initial idea is to just make per patch to map to a Git branch on their Git server, so we don't need to change anything on the clone ref.
There was a comment somewhere in here about patches depending on other patches, and
yeah, but so that's actually basically you could map all of this in theory to like Jarrett, and Prow already has some limited support for Jarrett. Basically, they just need to like take the patches and actually put them in there. But the extra bit is when it does that, when it's done doing that, it should kick off a job. And then there's the separate component of like, we should finally get email reporting to work, and maybe they can build this for us since they're going to need it more than we do at the moment.
Yeah, we would be do that, or we'd want to do that. Yes.
I just want to caution on scope and defining the scope and understanding what the state space of the problems that Testinfra is planning to solve and what they want to solve, because there are a set of constraints that matter to the ecosystem, and there are a set of constraints that matter to Google. This seems like a very Google-specific effort because there are Googlers in the same room talking about this. Now, I'm not saying that you can't apply this set of solutions to this domain, but I also want to make sure that as a SIG, that it belongs to a Kubernetes org, that we are doing what's in the best interests of the Kubernetes org and the whole encompassing space. Right?
So I agree with that. I think that at some point here, we are long overdue for splitting Prow out into its own sub-project. And I view this more as a design discussion and a real quick sanity check that this proposal fits in line with where the community as a whole would like Prow to go, making sure that the stuff we're proposing doesn't necessarily turn Prow into something it is not for the purposes of Kubernetes testing. So I agree, we can totally have this as a breakout discussion or something elsewhere, but right now, when we tell people about Prow and they need some forum to come bounce ideas off of, this is the meeting where they do that. So we can definitely like talk about plans to move Prow into its own sub-project, its own repo, et cetera, et cetera. There's kind of a lot of heavy lifting to be done there. So in as much as this was an ask for a quick sanity check of this proposal, I feel like that job has been accomplished here. I'm kind of wondering what we can do, if anything, or if there are any objections we have that we can raise in the next 2 minutes. Otherwise, I feel like we could move on to the next item. But I feel like this was a totally appropriate forum and audience for this discussion.
Super quick. Basically, I don't think we necessarily need to sign up to say own the ingest email part. Like that should probably live somewhere else. But the be able to send email part would be nice to have, and any kind of cleanup that comes about of like how the triggering interface works and things are things that we're kind of already doing. We should review this so that we can benefit from some of the effort, but like I would probably say something like the controller that handles the emails should just be another component so that, you know, Kubernetes as a sub-project is not trying to handle kernel mailing lists itself.
So
Yeah,
Ben, the way, go ahead.
Sorry, Andrew, one sec. Yeah, I mean, like at first blush, I agree. And like the way that this is factored right now in the proposal, like assuming we take the reporting out of Plank, I think it does address Tim's issue. As long as the components that they're building import our CRD client, they should have no problem writing those components entirely separately from Prow. And just if you deploy them on the same service and they interact with the Prow deployment by CRDs, they should work together, right?
I'm personally okay, even if this is in the tree of Prow potentially. I don't know. For me, it's more about the Prow deployment that Kubernetes runs may not necessarily use these plugins, but other deployments might, right?
Right. Yeah,
Again,
I guess I'm saying there's an option either way. Like I think to be not contentious, I think this would work sort of in a good direction.
Yeah, I just meant if we want to signal super strongly that like, hey, maybe Kubernetes SIG testing isn't signing up to like handle kernel mailing lists, like that portion doesn't necessarily
Yeah, that's
be.
No,
But
totally.
like the other things that need to happen, like Sin's been working on making reporting a separate component, and that has some nice properties. We can probably, you know, get them to help us with that as part of this, which will benefit Kubernetes. But we can possibly, if we want to keep scope down, we can do that without taking on the actual scope growing stuff.
so what I was trying to say earlier in terms of the notes, and I think this relates back to what y'all are saying. I'm saying that like everyone agrees. I think this problem should be couched as or discussed as a custom ingestion reporting and not specific to this use case, but that would satisfy this use case. Because Aaron, what it sounds like is that's a way that you want Prow to evolve anyway, not to be completely dependent upon GitHub for either. So
Sure, but I'm a huge fan of concrete use cases too, so it's not.
Oh, sure.
Need it, right? So I guess like we've hit the time box here. I want for this just to give us time for Patrick's discussions. Avi, I guess my ask to you is if you feel like you got what you needed out of this discussion. If not, I think we could certainly do like a breakout discussion or follow-up discussion. What would you like to do as next steps here?
Maybe just a small follow-up discussion later, just on how our idea is that we could work on adding most of this if that's the concern.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure we figure out exactly what we're going to do. But yeah, a breakout discussion afterwards would be helpful.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this is like a really well thought through design doc. There's even a picture and a diagram. It's great. Thank you. With that, I will move us on to a bunch of little questions that Patrick had. Patrick, are you? Yes, cool.
Yeah, I'm here. So basically, we're still on track to get Windows stable for version 1.13, and so it's critically important that we're on track to get the last tests online that need to be done. The first issue I had on the list was this 51540, asking about a unit test machine. And so I went back and tried to figure out what this actually means. I think what the original filer suggested was that we would want to be able to run the test task in Bazel on Windows. Is that what he's saying here?
Possibly. So we have this like written requirement, although it's really more of a loosely enforced suggestion, that unit tests should pass on every single operating system, including Windows, Mac, and Linux. But I don't think we actually continuously exercise them in that manner, other than developers' laptops. But
from a mechanics standpoint, the way those tests are executed is through Bazel today.
That's the way they're executed in both ways, I believe. Maybe Ben can correct me on that.
That's the way they're executed in pre-submit.
Yeah.
They're also executed in other ways in post-submit.
Yeah. The TLDR on Bazel is like, it is not the canonical way of doing things. If you can get like the makefile path to work, that's good enough.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so right now is the implication that, so do these run on the same box as the build machine when Prow actually does its blocking tests?
Yes.
They run in a rather large Kubernetes cluster. So that's a Linux Kubernetes cluster on GKE.
Okay. But like when you actually run the tests, are they launched as separate pods, or are they run within the same pod that did the build?
They're pods. Like we have different Prow jobs that do different things. Each of those creates a pod. Test is separate.
Okay. Can we get a 1 hour breakout on this sometime this week? Because I think at this point, I mean, the next step here is if we were to try to do something like this for 13, we really need to understand how that scheduling works. Because if it means that we have to have Windows nodes in the same cluster that Prow's running on, that's fine. GCE supports Windows, but we just sort of need to figure out, is this a version 13 or not? And
so
then what does the
it would have
design
to be a different cluster because it's a GKE cluster, which does not have Windows yet, but has saved us some maintenance costs. But it can run in different clusters. An example of that, there's a security subproject that's private, and we have a different cluster that runs that. We have another cluster that does some more trusted builds.
Yeah, but all the ones that are running blocking jobs are running in that GKE cluster that you're speaking of, right?
Yes, but like that's just like a maintenance thing. It could be more than one cluster. It would introduce some complications, but not for like say unit. Like for unit tests, that's not a problem.
Okay, I need some certainty this week because we're basically approaching code freeze, and I've got 1 week to either get this done for 13 or push it to 14. So how can we get to that certainty?
I would think this needs to be pushed to 14, considering how soon code freeze is. I don't think we can accomplish a lot in the remaining time frame.
That's what my gut is telling me. I don't view this as something that would impede the progress of Windows containers moving to stable, right? So as long as we can agree on that, I would be comfortable punting this. If it turns out this is blocking that, I can figure out how to help you work through that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it's something that's definitely worth doing. But so I guess the next step would be let's work together on a doc for what it would take for like how this could actually work from a mechanics standpoint. But we're not going to block on that for 13. Okay. So next item on the list was we had taken a proposal to SIG architecture and conformance, talking about how to deal with tests that need to run on Windows versus what needs to run on Linux. Currently, SIG architecture's recommendation is that we should go ahead and test in a hybrid cluster and use node selectors so that way can be done. So that way the right applicable OS can be chosen for that test. So there's basically two different ways to do that I have linked there. So is there anybody from SIG testing that would like to review those, or should we just continue taking up that discussion with SIG architecture and conformance?
I can take up review of this since I'm involved in both SIGs and am really looking into conformance.
Okay. All right.
So there's some weird issues that you mentioned. I don't know how to solve them in that there should probably be a pre-check because a hybridized cluster as part of a conformance test is not something that we explicitly support in any of the deployment tooling, right? Because you need to then label your entire cluster and do other different types of matching in order to support that. So as a result, like we in SIG cluster lifecycle, we explicitly state we do not support hybridized clusters of Windows and Linux. You have to be homogeneous. Otherwise, you're a grid. You're not a service deployment engine. You're doing a lot more extra matching.
So the code we have in kubetest can do it today.
I'm not saying the code can't. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that what it means to be a conformant cluster, if you're a hybrid, I don't know what that means because there no dev tooling allows that capability as a supported thing.
Tim, it's probably not the same thing, but if you had a cluster where one or two nodes allowed privileged containers, then I think it's the host mount test would still pass, and that's not exactly a hybrid, but it kind of is. I don't know.
I'm just going to stop us here and say these are all examples of discussion that needs to happen more in SIG architecture. SIG testing cares less about this sort of stuff. We're happy to enforce whatever it is that SIG architecture mandates as policy, but we don't care about defining what is or is not Kubernetes from a conformant perspective, right? We're here to help run the things. So
okay.
Go ahead.
So what I'm hearing is that like the mechanics of how we would need to change test cases and how they would be executed through Ginkgo and kubetest, those do matter here. The decisions on what the right definition is around a hybrid cluster is SIG architecture, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think I've really purposely been trying to avoid any discussion of profiles with that group, but I have started the discussion on the path of using additional stringly typed tags that you put into test names to define what a test does that seems to be weird. So to Andrew's example, I think I've got somebody adding like privileged tags to any tests that appear to require privileged behavior, the privileged thing, where like there could be some clusters that would deny that behavior through pod security policy and would thus fail conformance. And so we'll have to tackle the tricky question of whether we think that should or should not be considered conformance. But so we're kind of at the labeling stage rather than the what do we do about it stage, because that's going to be the SIG architecture's decision.
So actually, quick question for you, Patrick, off of this note. I saw earlier it mentions unit tests, but it sounds like what we're actually talking about is end-to-end tests.
Well, yeah, I moved from unit testing on to end-to-end testing.
Yeah.
So the end-to-end testing, we've got a PR open to add that as a non-block, as a periodic proud job. And that one is going to be running its own clusters actually on Azure, although there's no reason they couldn't be added to GCE later. If Yuju or someone wants to pick that up.
And then do we expect unit tests to be a problem as well? Because for example, we also don't exercise them on Mac at the moment, but
right. That's something I would love for us to solve, but that's why I don't think it's a critical blocker. Like I said, we write down unit tests should pass, but we don't enforce it. And so shockingly, it's up to a developer on Mac, maybe one of those, to bump into these problems and then fix them whenever they come up. So it'd be great if we avoided that situation on Windows as well. And then just to kind of jump forward to your other item there, Patrick, about you need review on some PRs. Since these are all conformance related PRs, pinging me would be appropriate, and I can start pushing them through. I already LGTM to approve the ones that looked obvious and raised the others that seemed like they might be changing behavior. That might change the definition of conformance to architecture, and you got some movement on those. So
okay, excellent. Okay, thanks for helping me navigate this. So that covers all the main stuff I wanted to understand. So
cool.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, everybody. That is our Tuesday. Thank you so much for showing up. I appreciate everybody's time, and we'll see you all next week. Happy Tuesday.